Welcome back to the Black Film Space TV Pilot Basics webinar with Rochée Jeffrey. This is going to be part 1 of 4 series. I'm excited. Reggie's excited. I know you guys are all excited. Thank you so much for coming through, especially after what happened last week. We are going to make sure that we are running a tight ship today. Again, if you guys have any questions, private message me or, write it in the chat in YouTube. I'll be periodically checking both. And just so you know, today's webinar is going to be recorded for those that cannot make it because of what happened last week. After that, we will not be recording the webinars. And Reggie will also drop the syllabus via WeTransfer. It's going to be a link in the Zoom and the YouTube live chat. So look out for that. Make sure you follow the syllabus so you can follow what Rochée is going to be discussing today. And yeah, I mean, let's just start off with Rochée Jeffries Bio. She is a writer, director, performer who hails originally from Jamaica. She's lent her writing talents to several television series, including the upcoming Hulu series Woke, starring Lamorne Morris, and currently she is the supervising producer on the show Bigger on BT+. She wrote the award-winning, Oscar-qualifying short film Suitable, which is screened at festivals around the world, including the Austin Film Festival and the Palm Springs International Film Festival's Short Fest. Suitable was also a finalist at the American Black Film Festival HBO competition and premiered on HBO in February 2019. Rochée directed the short Mr. Talented, which screened at the Directors Guild of America and was also nominated for an HBO Short Film Award. In 2017, Rochée was a Film Independent Project Involved Fellow and was recently selected as a 2019 Viacom Emerging Directors Fellow and a 2019 IFP/HBO Producers Fellow. Rochée is the writer and producer of Throw It Back and Make It Clap for Trudy Jones, set up with Paul Feig's FICO. The film was also featured on the 2019 hit list. And for those of you who are not familiar with Black Film Space, maybe this is your first event or you haven't been to many of our events, just to give you an overview of who we are. We are a nonprofit 501c3 organization committed to building a community of filmmakers from the African diaspora through skill enhancing and networking events. We are a collective of directors, screenwriters, producers, cinematographers, actors, and other media professionals that want to develop genuine connections and grow with fellow Black creatives. So yeah, shout out to Rochée, shout out to everybody supporting Black Film Space today. And again, just some basic rules. If you are in the Zoom chat, video is required. If you don't have your video on, I'm going to message you and harass you. Make sure you have your video on, or Reggie will. This is required. And no iPhone, no Samsung names. You have to put your actual name on your description, box. We're also going to use the raised hand feature in the Zoom chat. So for those of you in the Zoom that have questions, make sure you use the raised hand feature. I will call on you and then I'll let Rochée know that you have a question and then we'll unmute you and you can speak. We're also trying to take a few questions via the YouTube live chat. Don't go crazy, y'all. Just be patient with us. I know there's a lot of people on today, so we'll try to pick out whatever questions we can also. And just be mindful that YouTube Live has a 20-second delay, and the Q&A will start at 4:30 p.m. Yeah, let's do it.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here again. Last week was traumatic, but we're back and we're going to be stronger and we're going to hopefully learn and build some community. So let us get into it. All right. So I want to first give you a sense of what this class is going to be. And it's an overview. So, and I said this last week, we're going to spend 2 hours with each of the 4 subjects that are in the syllabus, but I want you to know that for each of the subjects that I'm going over, the reality is that you could really spend a whole month, 2 months, a year studying a lot of these subjects, okay? So this is just going to give you a little bit of an appetizer, okay? This is like boneless wings. This is not the full meal, right? So let me try to figure out, I think right now it's on annotate and I need to take it off. Hold on. Let's see. All right, so the class is going to, today we're going to be going over just the fundamentals, right? So before you're going into your, the process of developing your show, we want to make sure that you know exactly what you're trying to create, right? What kind of show it is, because the kind of show that it is going to determine ultimately, you know, how you approach writing the pilot. And so we want to start at the very basics of that, like understanding if it's an anthology series that you're trying to create, understanding if your show has legs, meaning should it be a show? Should it be a movie, right? Should it be a limited series, right? And so understanding all of those things. And then also, is it a half-hour comedy? Is it a half-hour drama? Because that is a new thing. Okay, so I'm trying to, right now we're having a little trouble with the slideshow, but we will figure it out. Okay, so first things first, in terms of defining what your, before you could even get into writing a pilot, right? The first thing you have to do is really sit and think about, right, the world building that you're trying to create, right? What is the world that your show exists in? Who are the characters and what the story engine is, okay? So once you, that is just the starting point, right? So you have to have an understanding of those elements. So although we're not going to go through character in this particular class, I'm going to do like an overview of just some of the basics you'll need with characters and world building. And we'll go through that in the subsequent class. So in this particular fundamentals class, we're going to learn what is a TV pilot. We're going to understand how to develop your pilot idea. And then we're going to move into some basic character stuff and world building stuff. Okay, so I'm going to get this to share. All right, does everyone see my screen? Thumbs up if you see my screen. Okay, now, there we go. Do you see the full thing? Great. All right, so what is a TV pilot, right? Now that sounds like a really basic question, but a lot of people actually kind of struggle this when we first start, right? Because a lot of times the first pilots we write, it's a sketch of an idea, right? And what a TV pilot is, look, it's the first episode of a narrative television show, right? You have to, they fall into different categories: comedy, dramedy, which is typically half hour. And then you have hour longs, which are typically dramas, but that is changing, right? There are some half hours dramas. Homecoming is an example on Amazon, the season with Janelle Monáe. That's a half-hour drama. But more typically, an hour long is a drama. So in the business, a lot of times where people, instead of saying comedy or drama, they'll refer to it as a half hour or hour long. And that's what they typically mean. In a pilot, you need to introduce the series regulars. Sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes the series regulars are introduced in a subsequent episode, right? Or subsequent episodes, right? But typically, if you're writing a pilot and I'm evaluating it either to hire you or to represent you as a manager or an agent or to buy the project, I want to get a sense of who are the characters that I'm going to see from week to week, right? And then it introduces the premise and the story engine. And we'll get into more of that in a subsequent slide, but we need to know what the show is about, right? And how many of us have read pilots and at the end you're like, so what's this show about, right? And we need to be clear about what are the stakes, what's the show about, what world are we living in, and what are the things that are going to generate story after episode after episode. That should be clear from the pilot. And we're also going to create a sense of the world in terms of structure and the conventions of the world, right? So if your show starts with a flashback in every episode, you can introduce those conventions after the pilot, but typically you want to have that in the pilot so it helps us to understand what you're trying to accomplish and what the tone is, right? If your character always has flash forwards because they see the future, then we need to see that in the pilot. Like, we don't want you to introduce that in the second episode, right? Just to be clear. So before you can develop your idea, as I was saying earlier, you have to determine what kind of show your show is going to be, right? Because the kind of show it is going to determine how you write the series. So you have to determine, is this a serial or episodic show? I'll explain that later. Again, is it half hour or is it an hour long? Is it an anthology series, right? Like the American Crime Stories are anthology, right? I think is American Horror as well, anthology. High Maintenance, right? And is it a limited? Or we're just going to see one season of this and move on? Is this something that you can see for network or cable? And the reason why that's important is because if it's a network show, it's going to have a different tone, and you're going to also have certain restrictions, right? Versus cable or streaming that happens to be a little bit more risque, darker, violent, things like that. So it's important to kind of understand what kind of where you see the show, because it will affect how you structure it as well, and how the actual material that you are writing. And then you have to determine, is it a premise pilot or an episodic pilot, right? I'll get into that. And is this something that you are writing as a writing sample that because you want to get a job or you want to get representation, or do you actually plan on selling it? And I'll get into that as well, okay? So serialized shows are shows where episodes are not contained, right? And so if you see in this graphic, you'll see some examples of serialized shows, meaning that whatever we are dealing with narratively in the episode, we're not necessarily going to resolve it by the end of the episode, right? A problem planted in episode 7 may not be resolved until season 4, episode 3, right? So the stories are continuing to grow on each other. They're escalating, they're compounding. So that's a serialized show. Now, one of the things that makes serialized shows what they are is that they have complex plots that carry from one episode to another. So if you watch them out of order, you might get lost, right? And they require season-long arcs. So when you're planning to, when you're writing on a serialized show, like when I'm in the writer's room, before we even write episode 2 of the season, we have mapped out an idea, a sketch of what all 10, 13, or 22 episodes look like, right? We have a loose sketch of where we're going because all the stories are going to build on each other, right? And in the world of streaming, your show, because it's serialized, you also have to have endings that are bingeable. That is like a mandate. So if you're writing on a show on Netflix or Hulu or HBO Max, your executive at those places are going to say, is this ending bingeable? Meaning, do you leave us with the ending where people feel like they have to watch the next episode, because that is their model, right? So that's why a lot of those episodes, that's why you can sit down and watch Netflix and just not leave. Like, you start watching something and like 6 episodes later, you're still there because they've ended it in a really interesting way that requires you to continue to watch, right? And then when you're dealing with a serialized show, there are 2 types of serialized shows, and that is a character-driven show, right, and a plot-driven show. Now, a character-driven show, the story engine, which I'll detail earlier, the story engine is essentially like, what is the thing that's creating story, right? What is the thing, like, for instance, if it's a show about crime, the crime is the story engine. And if it's a show about particular kinds of crime, like Special Victims Unit, it's sex crimes in New York. That is how those are the things that's what's propelling our story, right? So that's the thing that we're telling every week, right? If it's a show about a coffee shop, right, and it's about the people in the coffee shop, then the story engine is all the different clients in the coffee shop. They're generating the story, right? So in character-driven shows, your stories are about that character or a group of people, like family, co-workers, and their trials and tribulations and triumphs, right? So Insecure is a character-driven serialized show, right? And so they can often be dark. So there was a period where actually serialized shows weren't really that character driven. Actually, a lot of serialized shows, like character driven shows, are actually kind of a newer phenomenon, truthfully, because character driven serialized shows. There have been character driven procedurals, which we'll get to later, but this is a new phenomenon. It's been in the last 15 years that you see a lot of character driven serialized shows. And so what happens is they have a lot of anti-heroes. So there are darker serialized character driven shows like 6 Feet Under, Breaking Bad, and you have more grounded ones like Better Things and Insecure in the comedy space. And then there are also soapy serialized shows. My apologies, there's sirens everywhere because I live downtown LA. So if you hear sirens, there's a revolution going on. There's a lot happening. Okay. And then when you're plotting a serialized show that's character driven, the story comes from an emotional place and it comes from relationships. So it comes from emotional drama or relationship drama. And perfect example of that is Insecure, right? All of their story is really like Molly and Issa don't like each other now. Molly and Issa and Lawrence, it's all relationship driven. That's where you are your starting places when it comes to mapping out your stories, right? Now with plot driven shows, the storytelling is derived from the plot, right? So it's about story. So story is first, right? Character, of course, is going to work in tandem with that, but like really what we're dealing with is, okay, there is and usually those shows are like involve a lot of like big worlds, right? So like Game of Thrones is a plot driven show, but it has really interesting characters, but it really is plot driven. So our set pieces, our explosions, discovering a new world, we're just driving towards those things, like driving towards a battle, right? And then the character stuff is the stuff you layer on top of it, but really we're trying to service like these big set pieces and story moments, right? But even though the characters are compelling, as I said, the plot is ahead of the character development, right? And a lot of sci-fi genre shows, that's what they are. Game of Thrones, Star Trek, right? Some shows are both. I would argue that, and that's why they're also really good. If you think about exceptional dramas, a lot of times the ones that are both plot driven and character driven are the ones that get the most critical acclaim and the ones that people really respond to, right? Barry and Breaking Bad are examples of shows that I think are both, where the character is driving a lot of the story, but also the plot is driving the story as well. Okay. So then if your show is not one of those things, right? If it's not episodic, then it may be a procedural. So again, episodic contains shows where the story is resolved within the episode. There may be some serialized elements, but the primary story is usually contained, right? Blackish, Family Guy. So when you watch a Blackish episode, a problem is presented, right? The family deals with it. By the end of the episode, there's some resolution. Some stories may carry over into the next episode, but it's very clear this is contained. And then with the procedural, each episode is self-contained, right? So Law and Order is a perfect example, Grey's Anatomy, but Grey's Anatomy also has some serialized elements, but there's usually the A story is a story. It's like, this thing happens, we're dealing with it, there are obstacles, we're dealing with it, resolved, next episode. That's kind of how they work. And a lot of crime shows are procedurals, a lot of medical shows, like that's it. Now, when you're considering whether or not you want to do a half hour or hour long, the half hours have different structures, and they're different structures even within half hours, depending on whether it's network or cable. And when you're talking about hour long, same thing. There's different structure depending on cable or network. Okay, so I'll get into that. We'll have a whole class about structure. But is your show a comedy, right? Is your show funny, right? And it doesn't even have to be anymore. A lot of the shows that are nominated for best comedy, I'm like, no, there are no ha-has in this show at all. Like, it's sad, it's depressing, but it's half hour. One of my favorite shows of all time is Transparent. And Transparent has no laughs, but it is a half hour show. So that's something to think about too, is like in cable and in streaming, your show doesn't always have to be like jokes, right? It could be character driven, it could be smaller, more, and it could be grounded. And it can have like an undercurrent of humor, but it doesn't have to, you're not selling necessarily jokes sometimes. And then there's some half hours. I would argue that Insecure would sell jokes. It has jokes and it has drama, and it is a dramedy, right? As I said earlier, there's some half-hour dramas like Homecoming. Now, there are 3 different structures in the half-hour world. There's a single cam network. Now, single cam, multicam are terms you're going to hear in the business all the time. So if I say to my agent or whatever, hey, I want to sell a single cam show, he knows what I'm saying, right? And it means you're literally shooting it with one camera. But not necessarily one camera, but it means that instead of doing it in studio with a sitcom that's within studio, you're shooting it like we used to shoot, traditionally dramas, right? Single cams are also a newer phenomenon because usually comedies were shot on set. So Insecure is a single cam cable dramedy, right? And it affects the way that the show, the world of the show, because if you're doing a multicam show, meaning you're like Golden Girls, you're the Cosby Show, whatever, you're not going to have a whole bunch of locations, right? You can't be like, and then in this scene, they're in space. Like, no, they have 4 locations. It's the house, it's the job, it's the blah, 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 it's the blah, blah, blah. It's like 4 or 5 locations max because they're all building it within a studio. So that's going to affect your world. But if you're doing a show about just, say, take an example, a show about a coffee shop, that could be a show that lives in both a single cam space and a multicam space, because the single cam version of that show is we go home with them, the people who work at the coffee shop, they go on little adventures, we go to the park. And so that's a show that would require it to be single cam. The multicam is like, we build a coffee shop set, we build the office, and then we may have 2 or 3 other locations, and we keep the story contained to those locations, right? So when you're thinking about what kind of show you're doing, you have to think about essentially the world. Where do you want to take that world? And that will also determine whether it's multicam or single cam. And then also the other consideration is cable and streaming, very few multicams. There are a handful of them on cable and streaming. Usually when you think cable and streaming comedies, you're thinking single cam stuff, Atlanta, right? So that's also a huge part of determining like what tone you're going to be writing, depending on what where you're trying to get your show. Okay. And again, because platform determines content. Sometimes we work opposite. We think content determines the platform. That's really like, no, if you're writing for HBO, like if I sold a show tomorrow to HBO, they're going to read my script. And if it's cute and no one's cursing and nobody's having sex, they're going to be like, please leave, right? Because HBO, what they are doing is edgier stuff. Like that's what they're looking for, right? And then with hour-longs, right, they're generally dramas, but now they're hour-long dramedies like Jane the Virgin. And they're 2 different structures, which we'll get into in the subsequent weeks, but you have cable streaming, you have network. And again, your platform is going to determine a lot of what kind of content. So if you want your show to be on cable, then it's going to have a certain tone, right? And again, so anthology, right? When you're considering your ideas, because a lot of times writers at different stages of their career, sometimes they'll have an idea and I'm like, this is actually just an anthology series, or this is actually really just a limited series, because it doesn't really have an opportunity for it to be more than 25 episodes or 50 episodes, because we're aiming for 50 episodes, right? In the world of cable, if I'm buying your show, I want to know that there's at least 5-10 episodes, seasons in that idea, right? If I'm buying it for a network, I want to know that there are 100 episodes, right? So you have to think about, is this a show idea that I could see people coming back to for over 100 episodes? Is it an idea that could come back? People could, there are 50 stories I can tell here, right? And anthologies kind of made a comeback in the last few years, so there's also room for that. And then limited series are one and done seasons, typically a true story or a book adaptation that's too long or complex for a movie, but lacking enough of a story engine that you can't really see it go beyond one series. So Mrs. America is a limited series that's on right now that I actually think is pretty good. It's on FX. Normal People, I believe, is supposed to be a limited series, but sometimes like a limited series does so well, like Big Little Lies, that they're like, let's keep going. And then When They See Us is a limited series. And truthfully, it's harder for a writer who is not established to sell a limited series, to be honest. You know, you're better off at this if you're, you know, breaking into the industry, selling or writing a pilot that we can see that this could go 100 episodes or 50 episodes, because that's what people are going to assess your talent and your skill level as a writer. Can you write a world that could be expansive? And so I'm talking specifically, like breaking it down in terms of the networks. There are 5 networks, but the thing you have to understand too, right, is like the business is changing constantly. And right now we're moving towards a world where everything's cable, everything's streaming. Like even ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, NBC has Peacock, like they have a new streaming platform. So a lot of what I'm saying now may be obsolete in 2 years, right? When it comes to the distinction between networks and cable, because the things are starting to blend, right? But I will say in the structure piece, we'll talk about how there's a rigid act-based structure for networks. So you are writing to acts, right? Comedy is 3 acts. Dramas have 5, sometimes 6 acts. And that's important to know if you're writing something for network or cable. Okay. And as I said, with cable and binging, you know, it's usually you have a looser structure, and you don't have to necessarily adhere to acts, but it's smart to do that. Just removing the acts from your script, because you still want to hit some of those like structural moments. But with cable, you don't necessarily need act breaks. But some cable shows do, like The Walking Dead, right? Because it has commercials. But like if it's something on Netflix, they don't have commercials, like Ozark. So you would remove your act breaks from that pilot. Okay. Okay, so let's get into the fun nitty-gritty stuff. So let's talk about a premise pilot versus an episodic pilot. Okay. Before you write a pilot, you have to know, is this a premise pilot or is this an episodic pilot? What is a premise pilot? And a premise pilot establishes the premise of a show. It is what is this show about? But it is establishing the premise in a way that is at the beginning of whatever the premise is. So let me give an example. If your show is about a coffee shop in Brooklyn, right? The premise pilot version of that show is the black guy and the black woman, the black couple who buys the coffee shop, buy the coffee shop in the pilot, right? That's the premise pilot. The episodic pilot, which I'll get into later, is you start the show, the first episode is they already own this coffee shop and here comes the dilemma, right? And now they have to deal with it. So the premise pilot is taking us to the moment where the story kind of begins for your characters. Breaking Bad is a premise pilot, right? Ozark is a premise pilot. Insecure is an episodic pilot because it's not, you know, the day that Issa and Lawrence meet, right? It's not when Molly and Issa become friends. In that pilot, they're already friends. They're already living their lives, right? So usually in a lot of premise pilots, a major event happens that brings the cast together in some way. So with Lost, what is that? It's the plane crashes. So that's the premise, is starting the story with the major event. The episodic version of The Lost is they've been there for a week. And now there's some big thing that happened, and now they have to figure this out, right? It's also in terms of bringing an ensemble together. It's a major event. It's also a major event in a character's life. So if your show is about a character who has cancer, the premise pilot version of that is the day they find out they have cancer, right? And then you're introducing both the audience, the reader, and the characters to the main conflict of the show's premise. So if I get diagnosed with cancer, okay, that's a show, but I'm diagnosed with cancer, but I'm supposed to go train for something major and now I'm like, should I tell, my coaches that I have cancer? So that's the main conflict of the show outside of just having the cancer. This is where everything is kind of brought to the table, right? And then premise pilot also introduces like the major mysteries that need to be resolved throughout the course of the show. Okay. So then there are a lot of cons to premise pilots and there's some pros. Okay. Premise pilots are often, it's difficult because in the business, for instance, like premise pilots can pose a difficulty for you because a lot of people don't like them. And they don't like them because it doesn't necessarily give a clear picture of what the season or the show will be about sometimes. A lot of times there are a lot of more questions raised than answered. And a lot of times it requires a great deal of exposition to kind of set up what's happening. But again, a lot of there are a good number of shows that are premise pilots. So just know that. But a lot of times it's like, it's sometimes tricky to write. And I think premise pilots are the best if you feel like your story has to start with that major event, right? A lot of times it's the easiest thing for you to do, to be honest. It's like, it's just easier to start with them buying the shop, right? As opposed to it takes a lot of work sometimes to do an episodic pilot because now we have to establish all these relationships and dramas and conflicts without you actually sometimes seeing what that drama, conflict, or whatever it is, right? But premise pilots can be really amazing. Like the Breaking Bad pilot is one of the best pilots written, hands down, period, right? Because it is the premise of him starting on this meth journey, but it's really well done. And they're sometimes really great when you're taking a character on this really complicated journey to see them from the beginning, like what is happening. With Ozark, it's the same thing. We see the premise of them. Okay, now they're moving to the Ozarks and they're embarking on this crazy crime journey. The episodic version of that is they already live in the Ozarks, right? And they're already dealing with whatever they're doing. Now, an episodic pilot, Blackish is what is considered an episodic pilot, right? Because Blackish is like, they're already middle-class Blacks. They're already living in their neighborhood. They're already married and they already have their kids. Now it's just like, okay, this is a day in the life. So think of episodic pilots as we're starting off in just the normal of the world, okay? This is just their world. This is how it is. But a new problem within that world is introduced, okay? There are some shows actually that use the episodic, the episode number 2 as their pilot. Because sometimes what happens is the first episode is a premise pilot, and then they're like, eek. And then they write the second episode, and then the second episode has sometimes been used as the pilot because you realize that, we don't actually need to see the origin story of this. We could have started with episode essentially 2. So I always tell people, like, the episodic pilot, if you're writing it, to think of it as episode 2 of whatever your show is, right? If it had a premise pilot, right? Again, episodic pilots make sense for episodic shows. So shows where you have the beginning, middle, and end of each episode where the episode is contained. So Law and Order would be an episodic pilot, right? Procedural shows, yes. And a lot of comedies, especially multicams, tend to be episodic pilots. Sometimes they're not. Like, what's that show with the white kids in San Francisco? Full House. Full House's pilot is the Uncle Jesse and the other uncle moving in, right? So that it would be technically a premise pilot because they're officially moving in for the first time, right? But a lot of multicams are episodic. A lot of comedies are episodic, tend to be episodic. Okay, the pros and cons. Pro. And sometimes, I'll be honest, it takes work and skill to build up to writing good episodic pilots, right? Because you have to be able to learn how to write exposition in a way that doesn't feel exposition-y. And if anybody doesn't know what exposition is essentially like explaining the backgrounds and who people are and their relationships, right? So a lot of times the tendency is like, hello, I am your mother, aren't I? Right? Like that's a lot of what the exposition will feel like. And so it takes skills. It takes a lot of skill to get to a place where you can write an episodic pilot where it doesn't feel like your exposition is terrible, right? That's just facts. It takes a while to get to a point where your exposition is finessed, where you can establish relationships and why people are here and what they're doing without it feeling like you're explaining why they're here and what they're doing, right? But the pros of episodic pilots are that you clearly establish the tone, atmosphere, and scope of the potential series because they are presented in the pilot as they are. So we're just dropping we're dropping the audience into the world, right? So I don't, as an executive, a manager, agent, whatever, as somebody trying to hire you to write on my show, I read it and I'm like, cool, I got it. Like this group of people, they're all crazy. And these people talk like people I've never, we just get the sense of like, this is the way they move. This is how they operate. The dynamics of the characters and the relationships are also pre-existing. So you don't have to do a lot of the heavy lifting of having people meet each other for the first time, right? Which sometimes is a trick that you can use to help with exposition. So a lot of times when you write pilots, sometimes you'll introduce a new character into a world that's pre-existing because you can use that character as your window character. So if you watch a lot of pilots, you will see that happens a lot where like everybody else, like Grey's Anatomy, everybody else is there, but one person is new, right? So that way you can use that one person to take them on a tour of the world, which is really giving the audience a tour of the world, right? Because I think Meredith Grey is new to the hospital. So we're like, oh, and these are this person and that's that person and they're crazy. You can use that as a tool. But usually the dynamics of the characters are pre-existing. So yes, you can get out exposition creatively. Now, how do you develop your premise? Okay. Essentially, like, what is this show about? That's what the premise is. What is the show about? Is it a comedy or a drama or both? Is it tonally network or cable, a cable streaming show? What is the world of the show? Who are the main characters? Is it character driven or plot driven? Does it have a story engine? And when do you want to start telling the show? Is the story best served by a premise pilot or an episodic pilot? Okay, these are all questions you should be asking yourself as you develop your premise. Okay, this is what I'll say. A lot of this stuff, when I started writing, a lot of the stuff I was doing was very like, the premise was limited because it was like, I was a baby writer and I was trying to figure out how to write. And so a lot of times when I read writers who are, growing and aspiring, a lot of times their premise is not compelling enough, big enough, complex enough, right? You have to think about when you're developing your show idea, like, is this a character we've seen before? Is this a world we've seen before? And if we have, what makes this special? Why do I need to spend, I've worked on 7 seasons of television. I would say if you added up how much money was spent on all of those shows, it's like $150 million, right? Right? I've written 7 episodes of TV. Each episode, you add it all up, that was like $30 million was spent on producing something that I wrote. It's a lot of money, right? So when we're coming up with these ideas, we have to think, is somebody going to be like, I want to spend $20 million making a season of this show? Game of Thrones, $10 million an episode. So you have to say, was HBO like, we are willing, how many episodes did that show have? I mean, they spent maybe $500, $600 million? So these are the questions you have to ask yourself as you're developing your idea. Is this an idea that people are going to spend millions upon millions of dollars on? I mean, and that's the truth. That's if you're trying to sell it. If you're trying to write something that is a sample, which I'll get to later, for most of us at this stage of our careers, it is just going to be a sample that you will use to further your career. The question is this compelling enough that somebody's going to read more than 5 pages? Because I'm going to tell you right now, I have to read scripts all the time. I read 5 pages most of the time. If I like you a lot, I may read 10. If you've bought me a meal, I may read the whole thing, okay? And that's not me, that's the industry. If you're dealing with working writers, we're busy folk, we have to read a lot of stuff. And even when you are working to try to get a job, showrunners sometimes don't even read more than 10 pages of the scripts of the writers they hire, truthfully, because they just have an expectation that you have a certain number of credits, a certain amount of experience. They'll read 10 pages because that's all they have time for. If you can't make me go, they may not finish it, but if they are not at least interested in what else happened in the script, right? What was the point? And a lot of that has to do with the premise. Is the premise interesting enough to make people want to read? Okay. So let's talk about sample or sale, because I think it's important to think about that, because the way that you approach writing certain pilots is going to be about whether or not you want to sell it or whether or not you want to just use it as a sample. And the reason for that is if you're a novice screenwriter, more often than not, your pilot will be a sample used to get you work, attention, and representation, right? Now, as you develop in your career, you'll make determinations to see if what you write is something you want to sell or something to better market yourself as a writer. And let's talk about how samples are used, and then I'll tell you how to make the distinction for yourself, right? So samples are often used for contests and fellowships, which I think are very important when you're starting out. They're used to get representation with agents and managers. They're used to getting work as an assistant. So a lot of showrunners, before they hire an assistant, they will read them because they want to make sure that this is a writer's assistant. They want to make sure that if I hire this writer to be a writer's assistant, that's how a lot of people break into being a writer in the room. So I'm not going to hire an assistant who can't write because there's no upward mobility for you, right? So you use it a lot of the times for writer's assistant jobs, you need to submit a script to be read. And then of course, securing writing jobs throughout your career. Now, the reason why determining whether it's a sample or sale is going to speak to not only your premise, but also how you approach writing the script. Because if your premise, okay, you're a novice writer, you're trying to break in, you have a premise that is, say, Lost. Like your show is like the scope of Lost. It's big, and I would literally need to spend $50 million an episode to make your show. That's cool. But know that that's a sample, because of where you most likely are in your career, people are not going to be like even me, they're like, hey girl, that's cute. But are you a wealthy white man who's been doing this for 30 years? Like, that's just the way that it goes, right? If you look at the Game of Thrones guys, like they were huge feature writers. So they could, write a world that's big and expansive that could cost $10 million an episode and people would invest in it, right? So you have to think about that too. Like, if you're writing something at the start of your career that is really big and expansive and expensive to shoot, it's a sample for you. The likelihood of you selling that and that becoming a show, it just becomes more difficult. And that's not to curb anybody's dreams, like dream and anything can happen. Just know that that is something to consider, right? And so at this stage, I think it's important to focus on samples. And the reason why I think it's important to focus on samples is a sample offers you the opportunity to do wild, crazy, fun things, to take big swings, right? And you can then showcase your voice, because the thing that is singularly important at the start of your career is writing pilots, because that's how we get work and how we get representation, that showcase your voice, right? And so go for that. And even if it is a big, expensive idea, go for it. But just know that it's probably not going to be a sale. So you want to think about your premise also in that way. How can I showcase my voice with this premise? okay? So let's dig deeper into the development of the concept, right? So you have to think about, as you're developing your premise and the concept, is it low versus high? The who, what, why of your show, the characters, the story engine, the tone, and then I'm going to go through a premise checklist and then how you can create a log line, which I think is important to have before you start writing your pilot. So, so what is a low concept versus high concept when it comes to premises, right? A high concept is a story with a unique and concise premise that can be described in 3 sentences or less. Here's another little thing I'm going to tell you. If you're like, hey, Rochée, I have an idea for a show, and I ask you what that is, and 7 minutes later, I'm still standing there, we have a problem, okay? Your concept needs to be very clear and very concise, right? And high concept shows tend to have a clearly defined world in the pilot, right? Stakes need to be high and clear and event driven. So if you say like, I'm going to have a show like Lost or Game of Thrones, right? These are big, expansive worlds. That's a high concept show. Big, expansive world. It's event driven. There's a war coming. Aliens are dropping from the sky. That's high concept, right? Lost, plane crashes, and there's a mystery. Why are they there? What's that? It's a high concept show. And those shows tend to be serialized, tend to be plot driven because we're driving towards something. Low concept shows, and it sounds derogatory, but it's not, right? But a low concept show is a story that puts focus on the world and characters surrounding the plot instead of the plot itself. So Insecure is a low concept show. Normal People, which let me tell you, very Caucasian, on Hulu, delightful show. Those are low concept shows. Normal People is one of the lowest concept shows I've ever seen. It's literally 2 white people in Great Britain loving each other and having sex and then breaking up. But it's really well done. But it's so simple. It's like grounded, right? Better Things is another great white comedy on FX. Check it out. But it's like grounded. It's just people living their lives. So it's low concept. Now, if you have a low concept show, let me tell you, your characters need to pop. You can't have a low concept show and the characters are like, nah. Low concept shows need characters that we can fall in love with even if we hate them, because that's what we're watching. Period. And television is about characters, period, honestly, but especially in a low concept show, right? And they have to have compelling problems. It can't be like, I can't find love. Like, that's not low concept enough, right? It has to be, you have to find layers to that to make it as compelling as possible. Now, as you develop your premise, you need to think about the who, what, why of your show, okay? So what is the show about, right? Again, going back to the previous slide, where does the show live on television, okay? So when you're thinking about your pilot, it's like, yeah, where would this show live? Because that would affect the kind of content. If it's a show that I see being on like HBO or cable, I'm gonna write some sex and some violence, right? Because you need it, because those places mandate like sex. Sometimes they mandate like violence. It's not going to be cute and nice and everybody hugs at the end, right? So that's going to affect your tone. Why does the show exist? That is a question you will have to ask yourself throughout your entire writing career. Whether you're a writer, producer, whatever, this is a question that has to be asked. Why do we need this show? Right? What are the themes of the show? Are you exploring interesting themes that we haven't seen before? Or are your approach to examining themes that are familiar? Is it different? Is it original? Why do we need this show right now? What place is it taking in the world? What's going on in the world politically? What's going on in the world? What's in the zeitgeist? So why right now? And ask yourself, does the show establish a unique POV in its setting? Again, I swear to God, 80% of pilots, when people start off, is about a group of friends living somewhere, right? Or some people, or some roommates, or a group of friends trying to do something, group of friends trying to date, group of friends trying to, no. I'm gonna tell you right now, If that is the sole premise of your show, it's a problem, because there are literally a million pilots like that. Now, if you were like, hey girl, this is a show about a group of aliens trying to date, I'm in. I'm like, what? These aliens are trying to date? Like that, you have to find the angle to the storytelling that is original and compelling. Okay? It can't just be just one layer. It has to have multiple layers, right? So the question is, are there relationship dynamics we haven't seen in a show before? So think of some of the best shows you've ever watched. They present really compelling relationship dynamics. Now, let me give you an example of something from the syllabus, right? Ozark. The reason why I use Ozark, because honestly, I think Ozark is a really well-written pilot. And it's well-written for a lot of reasons that I'll go over later, but it's a really well-written pilot. If you read the pilot, and then if you watch the pilot, it's very good. But why is that show interesting? Well, we've seen shows with families or white guys, like middling white guys do crazy things. Breaking Bad. What was interesting, though, what they introduced in that show was a relationship dynamic we hadn't seen, which is that from the get-go, the wife was like, let's go, right? The wife was in on it. So it changed and it charged the show in a different way. It wasn't like Breaking Bad where the wife didn't know right away. She knew. And so that was an interesting relationship dynamic off top, right? Okay, now the pilot itself. Is there something bold, weird, and never seen before about this concept, right? You have to ask yourself that. Think about your favorite shows. You know, the ones that are really well respected, they have a cinematic moment. They have a moment we're like blown away by. And I'm going to spoil Ozark because you guys should have watched it and read it. But Ozark has this moment where Jason Bateman's character is running across the street and he's talking to himself because he's mad. He's about to confront his wife, right? And you're like, what we anticipate in that moment, he's going to go up these stairs and he's going to get on this elevator and he's going to yell at his wife. As he's walking across the street, we see a body fall splat from like a high rise. Never seen that before on a television show like that. It was super dramatic. It came out of nowhere and it was cinematic, right? It was a moment that was incredibly bold. And not only was it just a random guy, it was the guy that he saw her earlier having sex with, right? In his office, right? So unexpected moments, like, yes, we've seen people fall from buildings, but the way that was constructed and the way it was shot, everything about it, which comes from the script, right, is bold and it's never been seen before in the way it all came together. And the characters need to be original, right? A lot of the times what ends up happening is I'll read a pilot and not only are the characters within the same pilot, they have the same voice, but also those characters I've seen before, right? And I'll talk a little bit about character, but we'll have a whole class about it. And again, does it feature an image / set piece? Now, set piece is just like a big moment, dramatic moment. And again, with Ozark, it was that when that man fell, I was like, ooh, we're in for a ride on this show. That's when I was like, okay, this show is not going to be what you expect, right? So you need a dramatic image or moment that we haven't seen before. And does the pilot create a story engine that can sustain itself for a series? With Ozark, right? It does. The premise is they have to go to the Ozarks. They have to launder all of this money. And each episode, we're going to watch them have to make that happen. So that is the story engine, them trying to save their lives by laundering this money every episode. And that is clearly established in the pilot, which is a premise pilot, right? And is there a twist? I don't care if it's a drama. I don't care if it's a procedural. I think every episode of television has to have a twist. Every episode. Your pilot definitely needs to have one. Every episode has to have a moment where you're like, oh, didn't see that coming. If you don't have that in your episode, then what are we watching? Because you don't want your audience to be ahead of your story. So you always have to have a twist. Usually the twist happens, I think the twist happens at the end of the second act in a half hour and at the end of the fourth act in the drama. And we'll get into that. Okay, now characters. Just a little bit of an overview before we do that class, right? Great shows are about great characters, period. The reason why you like Game of Thrones is because you like those characters, right? Yeah, the story's cool, but you like the characters. The reason why Breaking Bad was compelling is because of Walter White. The reason why Atlanta is compelling is because those characters are so well drawn and specific and interesting, right? So great shows are about great characters. You want them to be unique and you want them to be something we've never seen before. Your main character needs to be a clear lead character, even if it's an ensemble piece. What happens is a lot of times, even in an ensemble piece, you still need one person who's driving the narrative, right? So even in a show about a family, there's still one person who's driving the narrative. If I read a pilot and I'm like, well, so who is the lead? Who's the person who's number one on the call sheet? So you have to be careful to make sure that your lead character is distinctive. And the character, if you're focusing on one character, they have to be compelling enough that I'm like, okay, I need to see a whole show about this person. Okay, here's the thing that is a universal truth. Contradictions make for great characters. The characters we love the most are the characters that are the most contradictory. Walter White is a buttoned-up chemistry teacher turned meth kingpin. Barry is a hitman turned aspiring actor. Right? It's characters who, Nurse Jackie, right? She's a nurse and a drug addict. And it's kind of formulaic, right? When you really think about it, like what ends up happening a lot of times with these characters that are really compelling is when you're crafting it, it's like, what is the opposite of what the person does for a living, right? What is the opposite of what their life looks like is their truth. So, on the outside, they're perfect and put together, but they suffer from multiple personality disorder, right? Like it's the easiest thing in the world. It's a formula. What is the outward facing life of this person? And then how do you take that and you contradict it? Mad Men, right? Don Draper is smooth and this and that, and everything about his life is a veneer. And you think he's like this, this woman's like, you think he's like single and at the end of the pilot, you find out he's married, right? So every great character is an exercise in contradictions. Every character needs to have a clearly defined goal, and that goal has to be established in the pilot. If I finish reading a pilot and I'm like, well, so what do they want? Right? Because what we're working towards is every episode is leading us towards what they ultimately want. That's the whole point. So if I don't know what they want, then I don't even know how to break that story. Because what are we leading towards? Now, what can happen is, what's really important is that you have two goals for the main character. The first one is like, okay, the big overarching, what's the big thing, right? So the goal is, I want to, just keep it simple. I want to get married. Say that's the goal for the whole series. But then they need to have a secondary goal that is what you're driving towards for the first season. So maybe that secondary goal is, I need a boyfriend, right? So that's what's going to drive us for season one. Then we're going to break that goal down even further. And for the pilot, it's, I'm going to get on a dating app. So in the pilot, we established that this person wants to get married. That's the big goal. But for this episode, they want to get on a dating app. So then when you're thinking about the season, we know that they're going to end up getting a boyfriend at the end of the season. You see what I'm saying? So it's, in order to really start writing the pilot, you need to know what the big goal is. You need to know what the steps towards that goal are. And then pilot is the smallest, it's a big move for that character, but it's one of the steps towards the bigger one. Their goal has to be incompatible with who they are as a person, right? You need to create flaws that are a hindrance to that goal. So in the pilot, I need to see, okay, if my goal is to be get married, and the goal for the season is to get a boyfriend, and the goal for this episode is to get on a dating app, this character needs to have a flaw that is a hindrance to all of those things. So maybe that person is a chronic liar, a pathological liar, right? So then it makes it difficult for them to accomplish this goal, right? So those are the things that you need to think about as you're creating these characters. What are their flaws? What are the things that make it difficult for them to accomplish their goal? And then every single television show has to have an antagonist, period. Whether it is an antagonist that is an actual person or an antagonist that is a problem, an internal problem, it always has to have an antagonist. And it needs to be clearly established in the pilot. What is this person up against? I recommend that as you start out, that the antagonist be another person, honestly, because it makes your life easier. It's a little bit harder to write antagonists that are like, more nebulous. It makes your life more difficult. If you can find a way to make it work in tandem where it could be an emotional issue, but like, is it manifested in an actual human being that personifies whatever the person's issues are, right? I love this show on Netflix called Feeling Good. And the pilot, I was like, oh Lord, because that happens. Most pilots, I'm also going to tell you this right now, most pilots are not good. That's just a fact. And the reason why pilots are not good a lot of the times is because they may be well written, but we don't know these people. So a lot of times that's why you'll be like, man, I had to watch 2 or 3 episodes before I got into this, right? So it's just hard to get into stuff. And then 2 or 3 episodes, okay, I get it. I get this person, I know who they are. So the pilot was like, okay. But then I watched the whole show in one sitting because it was exceptionally well done. It was this half hour set in Great Britain. But what was so interesting about that show is that the lead character's antagonist was herself. It was fascinating. Like, she was her biggest enemy and she was creating all these problems for herself. And she was a drug addict. And her antagonist was her girlfriend, right? It was fascinating. I've never seen anything like it where it's like, rarely do you see like somebody's significant other is actually their antagonist. But what I thought was smart in the writing was a lot of her issues were internal, but they decided to have it be personified in the girlfriend. The girlfriend brought out all of this girl's like anxiety and issues and problems, right? So that's what you want to aim for, is having an antagonist that is well-defined and can be personified in human form. Who is this actual person that we're up against? Okay, now let's get it further into the story engine, because you're going to need to have that. Once you have the character, you have to figure out the story engine. And actually the characters should be driving a lot of the story, or the story is driving a lot of the character if it is a high concept show. So again, it's the driving narrative force that generates episode and series arcs. You have to establish the story engine in the pilot so that viewers can see the story has legs. Because let me tell you, that is the number one way to kill a pilot. The number one way for a pilot not to work is for me to be like, so what happens after this? Like, if after you read the pilot, you're like, well, I don't really know what happens, then you don't have a story engine. I don't know what episode 2 looks like because there wasn't a story engine established. So your story engine is dependent on whether it's a plot or character-driven show. So plot-driven, story engine is mystery established in the pilot about the mystery surrounding the island, right? Character-driven, Insecure, story engine is her trials. It's her trials and tribulations as a Black millennial woman in LA. So that's where when we sit down in the writer's room to break this story, we know what more trials and tribulations can we give her about her personal life. That's going to be the story generator. The pilot dilemma is the series dilemma. So this is what that means. Whatever problem I'm introducing for the character in that pilot needs to be tied into what her entire dilemma is for the whole show. So if the show is about, using a simple example, someone who wants to get married, the pilot dilemma has to be about that. Because if it's not about that, I'm like, well, so what is this about, right? So it may be a smaller version of that story. So her pilot dilemma may not be about marriage per se, but it's like her anxiety about getting on dating apps, to keep it simple, right? So the pilot dilemma equals the series dilemma. Whatever you establish in the pilot is what we are going to expect the show is about. And it's also the thing that's introducing the story engine. So the pilot dilemma for Lost is their plane crashes onto this mysterious island and they need to survive, which is tied into the larger dilemma of why are they on this island in the first place? Story engines must have conflict and obstacles built in. Now, this is something I'm going to tell you. I see it all the time. A lot of pilots have no conflict. A lot of movies, a lot of features have no conflict. I'm like, so what? We're just watching people live. You have to create conflict. And each scene has to be an escalation of that conflict, right? So you have to create, again, a clear antagonist, clear obstacles throughout the episode. So conflict, right? That is important. You don't want it to be forced. It just has to be clear who these people are, who these characters are, how they are going to be in conflict with one another. And when you craft your characters, you want to orient them in a way that allows for there to be consistent conflict throughout 100 episodes of television. One of my favorite shows of all time, Golden Girls. You know why Golden Girls is good? Show is amazing. The show is incredibly well written. And you know why it's good? Because the characters are so clear that you could literally cut to Rose after Blanche says something. And Rose don't even have to say anything and you know what she's thinking, right? Because their conflicts are clear. We know their distinctive personalities. We know how they see the world. They have distinctive POVs. So we know that. And that's also the thing that's going to generate story, because we know who these people are. So we know their conflicts, we know how they see the world, and that's going to help us generate story episode to episode. Okay, tone. Tone is also really important as you're writing your pilot, because your pilot is establishing the tone of your show, right? And it also helps to establish the genre of the pilot and the series. So what is your show's outlook on the world, right? Is it dark or lighthearted? Is it grounded or farcical, right? Is the dialogue and humor, dialogue and humor is a huge way to set tone, right? One of the best pilots ever written, hands down, period, end of story, is Grey's Anatomy. There's a reason why Shonda Rhimes broke out the way she did. That pilot is lit, okay? And if you read the first page of that pilot, and just read the first page of it, you're like, holy shit. Because she has such a distinctive voice. The way she writes her dialogue, it's like fast-paced and crazy, and characters tell you everything they're thinking, but in a way that doesn't feel crazy. And it's so clear what the tone of that show is, just from the first page. So tone a lot of times is determined by characters, how they speak, also determined by say the comedy in the world. If you're doing a comedy, is it big comedy, right? Is it broad? Are people falling? Are there fart jokes? All those things determine the tone. And you have to think about that as you're approaching your pilot. What is the tone, right? And is it clear? Because I'm sure everybody's watched a show, movie, write a script, and you're like, so what is the tone here? Like, is it, what? And it kind of throws you off. So it should be also consistent. Now, one of the things I do, and which everyone pretty much should do, I think is a universal thing, because you're going to be asked this. What are the tonal comps, right? So when you're thinking about and developing your show, it's helpful to think about the tone of your show relative to existing shows. Because one, if you ever go out to pitch your show, that's what you're going to have to say it. Like, this is Insecure meets blah, blah, blah. This is Atlanta meets Feeling Good. That is going to help you as the writer understand what tone you're going for, right? And I think it's really important to know that too. Okay. Now here's your premise checklist, okay? Before you kind of get into even writing the pilot. What is the show about? Can I explain the premise, concept in one sentence? Is the tone of the show clear, appealing, and consistent? Now, these words are subjective, right? What is appealing? And I'm not saying appealing to the white gaze. Okay, let's just take that off because that's a different conversation. But is it appealing? Is it a show where it's like, yes, like, you know, when you tell your friends about it, are people like, oh, that's dope? I mean, honestly, that's me. At this stage of my career, I still pitch ideas to my friends and my manager and my agents. And I'm like, if they're like, oh, that's cool, I'm like, okay, well, this is not really an appealing concept, right? Is it something that people would be excited about, right? And now, are there characters who are compelling and original? Is there an antagonist, right? Is there a major goal established for the main characters? Are there relationships that we haven't seen before in a series? Does the concept of the series or a main character contain a fundamental ironic contradiction? Right? Is there a story engine established in the pilot? Is there a clear reason why this show should exist? Do you know where the show lives? Is this something that you think people will get excited about? Which is back to the original point, right? Again, because you need people to read more than 5 pages. Now, I think it's important. I do a lot of prep work before I even write a pilot. So I do a lot of brainstorming. I do a lot of character bios. Then I do a lot of structural work. Then I beat out all the beats. But before I can even get started on that, I have to think about what the log line of my show is, right? And if I can't figure that out, if I don't know what the log line of this show is, then I have nothing to write, because then that means I don't know what my show is about. So before you can start writing a pilot, the log line for a pilot series has to be clear and concise. And a log line is a 1 to 2 synopsis of a TV show's concept, plot, and characters. It should contain the central conflict of the story. It should contain a summary of both the pilot and the premise of the series. Now, again, if you have trouble articulating a logline for your show, you may not be ready to start writing the pilot. Now, this is what I'll also say. Loglines are always evolving. I'm writing a pilot now. I've written the logline 7 times. And that's because I didn't really know what my show was about. So as I started to really understand more and more what my show was about, the logline became more and more concise and clear. Okay. So here's this is a logline formula. And if you guys can identify the show after you read the logline, then I'm sure it's pretty clear, right? Logline formula number 1. This is an action logline. So you have the inciting incident, the protagonist, the action, the antagonist, right? So when a young boy disappears, that's the inciting incident. His mother, a police chief, and his friends, the protagonist, must confront terrifying forces in order to get him back. Right? Now, that is the show. Right? And so from that, it's like, okay, now this is what the show is about. If I read this log line and I'm considering to read different scripts, considering between different scripts to read, and I'm interested because I'm like, this log line could be better, to be honest, but a young boy disappears. His mother, the police chief, and his friends must confront terrifying forces. Now, what does terrifying forces mean? I don't know. But if it's supernatural forces or something like that, right? I'm going to be interested in reading that, right? Like, oh, what are these supernatural forces that they have to confront, right? So you want to think about those elements. And then this is the goal-based logline, right? Protagonist, action, antagonist, goals, stake. Okay. A young man leads his oddball family and their real estate development business following a securities fraud fiasco that put the father in jail. Now, this is Arrested Development's logline. Now, there's some interesting elements in here, right? Oddball family, real estate development business, securities fraud, father is in jail, right? But it's clear what this show is about, right? And so to me, this is a good starting place. We clearly know what the show's about. We know it's a young man. He's our guy. We know that we're also following the family. So they're also the other characters. We know what world we're in. It's a real estate development business. We know the conflict. There was a securities fraud fiasco, which is the premise. And he has to lead this family despite the fact that their father is in jail, which is another conflict. And these are elements we haven't really seen on a show before, right? At the time that Arrested Development came out. So being able to synthesize your idea and your premise into one sentence is really, really important for you to be able to move on with developing the show further. Okay, so this is just like the beginning, right? This is just, again, the appetizer, the boneless wings. So I want to open up the floor for people to ask questions about what we just talked about. And then I'm on Instagram. I can't give out my email because, Lord, I mean, I love you all, but I will give out my Instagram if you ever want to stay in touch in that way. But yeah, please feel free. I think we have 45 minutes to chat.
Awesome. We don't have any raised hands in Zoom yet, but we do have some written questions. Sorry, I'm just loading them up. Okay, so Jamila Velinor, I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong. She had a question. She was on YouTube. She wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about hour-long comedies and how valuable they are.
To my understanding, there's no such thing as hour-long comedies, and maybe they will come to exist. There are dramedies like Jane the Virgin, Orange is the New Black, but comedies being hour-long, I think, is a little bit of a difficulty because comedy requires a certain number of jokes, to be honest, right? Like when you're writing a comedy, when you're saying this is a comedy, you're talking about 3 to 5 jokes per page. That's kind of the standard. And to do that for 50 pages is a lot of work, right? To 40 to 50 pages. So that's why comedies tend to be shorter. So I don't really see a world with hour-long comedies, but dramedies that blend both drama and comedy, sure.
Okay. Shannon Hawkins in Zoom. Sorry, I'm asking her to unmute.
Hi,
There we
thank
go.
you so much for the presentation and lesson. It was really awesome. My question is around samples. And I know you mentioned you want to write with the idea that this can be built out to 100 or 50 episodes, but do you think when you're creating a sample, it's okay to say this is a limited series because you're just trying to showcase your voice and create a story and a pilot? Or do you feel like your sample should also kind of reflect that industry standard of 50 to 100 episodes?
I think sample should be something that the world could be expansive and it could be a 50 to 100 episode show. I just don't see limited series, writing a limited series. The reason why it hampers you is if I read your pilot, then I think to myself, well, where is this going? Because there are only so many episodes that I can see out of it. And the goal is when I read your pilot, I want to be able to see, oh, you establish a world that it could be expansive. That's the whole challenge of a pilot and the goal of it. If you write one for a limited series, it's going to feel limited. So I think sample should be 50, something that the reader can go, oh, 50 to 100 episodes.
Okay, I'm going to go to another YouTube comment from Ethan Frome or Frome. He wanted to know if the sample or sale, discernment that you make when you write your script, does it also apply to animation ideas?
Animation, you can go wild, buddy. That's why I love animation. Okay. Animation is a great playground because you don't have the same budgetary limitations. Now, this is the thing, we're like, I'm assuming most of us here are like earlier in our writing careers. So you're not really thinking about that, but as a working writer, you think about money because you have to think about, like, if I sell this, what is the investment that folks are going to make? Or if I'm trying to use this as a sample, or the fact that if I'm a younger writer in the business, if I have an expansive big world, they're just going to assume that it's a sample. And Animation allows you to circumvent all of that talk, because really you could do anything you want in animation. People can explode, people could disappear, it could be ornate because it's animation. And so it's just a little bit more expansive.
Okay. So many people have questions. All right. I'm gonna try to manage y'all. Concepcion de Leon.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Rochée. That was really, really helpful. I have two brief questions. One is, I wonder if you could go into the difference between multi-camera and single camera a little bit more, and what shows they're used for. I know obviously it's like one camera versus several, but like I can't kind of like understand what the difference is. And then also, is with the logline formulas, do the logline formulas go with a particular kind of show, or is it just, you know, either formula can be used for any kind of show?
I think they could honestly be used and tweaked for any kind of show, because no matter what, if you're really trying to elevate your show idea, they should always have a goal. There should always be a conflict, and there should always be an antagonist, right? The antagonist may not be a person in some shows. Like the antagonist, it may not be personified in that way. So like the antagonist may be like the mother has died, and now the father has to raise his kids, and he didn't spend time with them. So the antagonist is really like a father, like his deficiencies as a father. That's the antagonist. So you have to think about like how you would adjust those log lines to fit something like that. But you can still articulate like the father who's incompetent tries to raise his kids after his wife dies, and he you know, despite all of his failings, right? So you'd have to like adjust it. As to your first question, so multicams tend to be like more traditional comedies, right? It's the Golden Girls. They're kind of making a comeback now. There are some, CBS loves a multicam. But again, in those shows, they tend to be, they're not as edgy typically. And also they work with shows where you're not expecting to go to a whole bunch of different locations all the time, right? If you notice, the Cosby Show had like 4 locations, right? They were always in the house. They maybe went to the doctor's office, and they went to other places. So it's a limited world. So if your show has a limited world, that is when a multicam makes sense. And if it's not really edgy, multicam. If you're trying to do a show like Modern Family, which is a single cam show, actually also Blackish is a single cam show, but that was a stylistic choice, because technically Blackish could have been a multicam because they were pretty much in the house, right? And then a couple other locations. But they decided to do a single cam because I think they were trying to set themselves apart stylistically. But typically single cam comedies are edgier, and they just have an expansive world. So in Modern Family, they have so many families in that show, they couldn't do a multicam because there would be just too many sets. So they just were like, well, let's throw a camera up and we're gonna do it that way, because they have 3 families, I think they follow 3 or 4, and multiple locations. So there are also practical reasons why you do single cams outside of the tonal reasons.
Elizabeth Strong.
Hey, thanks, Rochée. I just wanted to ask if you have any specific tips about how to sell like a low concept show, like the British one on Netflix that you said was really well done. That's just really simple. I was just wondering, what is it about that show that kind of drew people in at first?
Well, 1, be white. 2, I mean, I'll be honest, like it's a lot easier for white people to sell low concept shows. It's harder for the part of the reason why I think we cling to Insecure is because it is one of the few cable low concept Black people just living their live shows that have ever existed. It's just really hard. I think that if this woman who's at the lead of the show is a Canadian comedian, so she's a stand-up. So I think also, irrespective of all those racial politics I just brought up, but if you're a name, you can get a low concept show, right? Because they're like, oh, you're a stand-up comedian, you're a YouTube sensation, you've proven that you have an audience. So they're more inclined to take on a show like that. If you want to write low concept shows, I've written samples for low concept shows. That's fine. You can if you write a compelling sample for a low concept show, that's all good. Selling it is another story. And then getting it on the air, that's another story. You have a way more obstacles for that. And the reason why Issa exists is because she had an audience, right? Like Insecure already had followers. And if she were just Issa, random Black girl, that'd have been like, blessed, be blessed, have a wonderful life. Like, yeah.
Okay, Alec Jordan.
Hi, Rochée. Thank you again for a wonderful lecture, first of all. I had two quick questions. First question, how long do you think that you should spend on brainstorming and prep work before you begin your pilot or even write your log line for that matter? And then secondly, could you just reiterate the key difference between procedural and episodic work? Because it kind of seems like procedural could be episodic in a way, but maybe I'm misunderstanding something there.
Sorry, the first question again, sorry.
How long should you take for prep work and brainstorming before you write your pilot or log line for that matter?
Take as long as you need. I mean, the thing that's interesting about me is, I don't go through too many drafts of my work because I spend a lot of time thinking about it and prepping it out and outlining it and figuring it out. And before I even started to do interior wherever, right? Before I even get into final draft. And so I think it's important to do a lot of prep work before you start writing and really understanding your characters, your stories, and where they're going. But that's a personal thing. There have been times where I had an idea and I was just like, let's go. And I, sketched it out and I started moving really quickly. But I think it's dependent on what your style is and how much information you need to really get started. But I think the more preparation, the better. As for your question about procedurals. So procedurals are an episode where something is presented within the episode where the A story is typically, and we'll talk about A, B, and C stories. But the main story of the episode is introduced within that episode and resolved within that episode. And that's it. So Law and Order, somebody dies, they investigate it, they resolve it at the end of the episode. Now, some shows are a combination, like ER, where a patient comes in, they try to figure it out, resolved, but then all the interpersonal dynamics with all the doctors and everything continue in a serialized manner over the course of the series. See what I'm saying? So procedurals are usually, that's why they're case of the week shows. Scandal started off as a procedural. Scandal started off with every episode was a new scandal that Olivia Pope was dealing with, and then she would resolve it, and then she had a crazy personal life, right? That carried over several episodes. At a certain point, it went from being a procedural to being just a serialized show, where it was just like problems, craziness, boys, things, and then like every episode, it just kept building on that. Is that clear?
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm gonna do a YouTube question, guys. Can the log line change from season to season, or should the log line cover the entire series?
So log lines for pilots are tricky in that.
And that was from Rebecca Spencer, sorry.
Yeah, log lines for a series should cover the entire series, right? They should be, this is what this show is about. And that should not change from season to season. Different goals, different obstacles, different problems arise, but that series logline should still be relevant. If Insecure's logline is 2 Black women in Los Angeles navigate love and life, let's say that's what their logline is, despite their insecurities, that is still the logline of the show to this day, right? And so it should be, you shouldn't be changing because the logline is the goal. The logline is the story engine, and that shouldn't be changing from season to season.
Eli Brown.
Yes, how are you? Again, thank you for the class, the lecture. It was beautiful. Definitely learned a lot from listening to you, and I look forward to learning some more for the next classes. My question is about character growth. I'm not sure if we got into that or if it has a place in a pilot, but where would you say character growth sits in a pilot, or is that too soon? Or is it so for instance, in a pilot, is it really, just problem set up, and then tune in next week to see how they, get out of it? Or is it like, you do see some growth in the character before the end of that pilot, so producers kind of know where this character is going?
The latter is correct. So so here's a mistake a lot of people make in pilots, is like the character will have a problem, and then by the end of the pilot, they've solved it. Right? So it's like, or the character has a problem, and then we don't see any movement.
Right.
And so what you want is to have some movement in the direction, or a setback. So you either want a movement or a setback, because something has to happen. The goal is still here, but we either need to move here or here each episode, right? What happens is everybody knows a show where you're like, can they grow, please? Like, everybody had that show where you're like, you're frustrated with a character because this has been the goal and they still here. Like, what you ideally want is, by the end of the pilot, I've seen that this character has, for instance, a character never stands up for themselves, and they want their goal, which is nebulous. Don't ever make this your goal for a character, but let's say their goal is to find their voice by the end of the show, right there, the series finale. What happens is, okay, maybe at the end of the pilot, they decide to cuss somebody out, right? And then when they do, they end up like losing their job, right? And then they go back to being this like person who's not outspoken, doesn't speak up for themselves, right? Because that's the twist, right? But they made some movement, but now they're kind of back to square one. That's okay too in a pilot, right? It's as long as you see a character trying to do something, that's what we need to see. We need to see characters trying, because it's just like Friends. How many friends do you have where you're like, girl, if you don't get some new problems, you know what I mean? So like, that's how characters should be too. We should be seeing them try. And if you don't have that in the pilot, some effort, even if they end up at square one, then it's a problem.
Thank you very much.
Adrian Snow.
Hey, Rochée.
Hey.
Hey, I just had a question in terms of, like, I wrote it down, doing a web series as kind of a condensed version of your pilot. Like, is there any worth in that? And also kind of figuring out how to develop your own writing by writing short episodics of a web series to kind of build your writing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, if you look, I'm using Insecure because it's a perfect example of this. Awkward Black Girl. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's essentially what they did. They made that into it was like a mini writer's room. You know, a lot of people don't know that Issa didn't write a lot of those episodes. She had a writer's room. She had writers who wrote each of those episodes. And so it was like a mini TV show. So I do think that web series can be a great and fertile place to learn how to craft narrative, and to play with ideas for a larger narrative. And we've seen, because let's be honest, Awkward Black Girl is Insecure. Like, I mean, it was the thing that started it. So it's kind of the same world. So you can use your web series as a way to kind of say, hey, this is the show that I want to do, the larger traditional idea, but it's in this smaller, like snackable series. What I will say though, a lot of web series play too small. So what happens is you'll watch a web series and you're like, okay, what happened this episode, right? I think that structurally web series should feel like a show, because the reason why I say that is there's so many web series, right? And now the game is like, I watch web series and I'm like, did they have $1 million budget? Like, some of these web series are popping. Mm-hmm. So it should feel like a show in the sense that like it has a middle, beginning, and end of the episode, right? Like it feels like I actually saw something happen. So that's something I think to take into consideration too, is like after writing web series is like replicating the idea of like a larger narrative and more place to play with story.
Cool, thank you.
Kim Swingler. Hey, Kim. Kim? Hello, Kim. I unmuted you. I might have to skip you. Going once.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yes, we can.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay.
So Rochée, thank you so much. This was very informative. I have a question about samples. Like, about how many samples should a beginner writer have if they're trying to get representation or trying to just showcase their work?
So there are two answers to that. So I think that you should always go into everything with like two or three good ones, right? But those 2 or 3 good ones come out of 20 scripts you probably writing. Like, I'm gonna be real. Like, one of my really good friends is killing it as a writer on everything that you've ever seen in your life. And it took her writing 15 pilots before she got staffed as a writer, right? So it takes work. So it's 3 scripts out of the 15 or the 20 that you write that will be like the good enough for you to be like, hey, manager, agent, I'm a writer. But I think if you can say that I've done it 3 times, I've done 3 good scripts, you're in a place to get representation and to get possibly staff.
Okay.
David Frazier.
Hi. Yeah, real quick. Thank you, Rochée, for this. This was really cool to see. Mostly, I was just thinking about what you were talking about, the fundamental contradictions. And I was wondering if you could somehow explain like when a contradiction is too far left. Because, you know, like some shows, the contradictions will be a little bit too impractical, while like they should be crazy enough to where it's just good, but also surprising. So if you had anything.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I think, like, for instance, Breaking Bad could have gone really bad. Like, this idea of like, oh, a teacher, like button-up guy, and then now he's making meth, right? You could have easily been like, that doesn't make a lick of sense. But that's why that show is so well written, because they crafted it in a way, they built his journey in that pilot was going from a place of middling basic white man to I'm going to sell and I'm going to make meth. And they slowly built us up to the contradiction. Do you see what I'm saying? They didn't just like start off with, if they had done an episodic pilot where he was a teacher and he was making meth, we probably would have been like, what? We needed to see him slowly become that thing that was far left. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So sometimes, like, if you want a contradiction that is like far away from where the person is now, you need to show us getting there by the end of the pilot. Like, build it up so that we're like, oh, okay, I could see how he got here or she got here.
That makes sense. Okay. So just like spelling it out.
Yeah. Peeling back the layers. And then we're like, oh.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Tari N on YouTube, he said that he had a friend who was a first-time writer and got a pilot shopped around. In what cases do you think that happens?
Okay, so this is what I'm gonna say. I don't want to hurt people's feelings.
Keep it real.
I'm just gonna be real. There's a lot of talk in Hollywood, okay? A lot of talk. People will talk. I've sold this, I sent this around, this is going around. Or we're interested, we're gonna try to make this, let's do this, coffee, tea, let's make it. So that's always gonna happen. The reality of somebody who is an unknown, unestablished writer selling something and making it on the air is very, very, it's slim, okay? It takes a lot of different, it takes, for someone who's repped and working to get something on the air, is almost impossible, right? And that's just the reality. A lot of us make our living as television writers. We make our living, one, writing on shows, but there are actually a good number of television writers that just make a living writing pilots that they sell that we never see. Okay, that's the practical thing. I have friends who for years have beautiful homes and we've never seen anything they've ever written, right? And this is just the practical stuff. The hopeful side is, I think that anything is possible right? And there was this show called Extant, which was on CBS. It starred Holly Berry. And that story is interesting. The guy who wrote that script submitted it to, was an unrepped writer, submitted it to a contest with Tracking Board or Tracking B. He won the contest. Tracking B sent that script out to a bunch of people. Amblin Entertainment, which is Steven Spielberg's company, read the script and was like, let's go. So this man went from writing in his house to having a whole ass television on TV, a show on television, right? So that is possible too, right? But the practical, like I'm at the point where, you know, what's her name? Courtney Kemp Agbo, who created Power, once said this, and I was like, this is how I'm gonna have to live my life. She was like, the one thing I've learned is to have no expectations of this business, because it's the only thing that will keep you sane, right? So, you know, the idea that this person's getting their stuff shopped around is really cool, and that's really great. But there's a lot of talk, right? And so just being able to navigate that and ask the right questions and surround yourself with the right people as decisions are being made is really important.
Great. We're gonna go to Kaya Jones. I'm sorry if I'm saying it wrong.
Hello, I'm Jay. This is Kaya. Yeah. Thank you very much for everything. My question is, when it comes to samples, should they all be the same genre or switch them up?
So here's what I'll say. I've written on 3 comedies and 3 dramas. Most people don't, right? So maybe I would say 10 to 15% of writers I know can do work in both fields. What I will say is that when you're starting off, you should have most of your samples in one genre, right? Then once you have 2 good comedy samples, then you can do 2 drama. You don't want to be like, here's a comedy and then here's a drama, because then, for instance, my last job for this woke show, the showrunner was like, hey, my manager sent her a script. She was like, I want to read another one. So I had a backup. I had a comedy, another backup sample, right? If she said, I want to read another one and I have a drama, she would have been like, sis, what? You know what I'm saying? So I think it's important to have like a clearly defined voice in one space before you move to the next, so that you also have multiple samples in one area, because you might need them, right? You don't want to like be splitting your focus. Yeah.
Thank you. HU.
So hey.
So Ebony Tankersley in the chat, she asked, is it a good idea to write many episodes of one series, or better to write pilots for different series?
Pilots for different series. Because I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. If you're an unknown writer or a lower level writer, and I don't know if you guys know the levels in writers' rooms, but I'll briefly go over it. But staff writer is the lowest level. Then it's story editor, executive story editor, co-producer, producer, supervising producer, co-EP, EP. Co-EP and supervising producer, we're upper level, right? So we're managing rooms. And then the middle level, and then staff writer, right? Staff writer, story editor, those are the lower levels. So if you're a lower level writer and you come to sell a show at Netflix, and Netflix is like, cool, this is awesome, this is cute, we want to do this. And you're like, and I wrote the rest of the episodes. They're going to be like, no, right? Because what's going to happen is they're going to bring on a showrunner who's going to manage you and run the show most likely, right? And then they're going to bring on a team of writers who they're paying millions of dollars. So what's going to happen is that one episode is nice. They're going to hire a team of writers who are going to write the rest of the episodes. And then you may write like the season finale or whatever. There are rare instances where you could do something like that, where you write multiple episodes and they're like, we have to do this. But the likelihood of that is slim. So your better investment is just to write the pilot and continue to write other pilots. I know one guy, it was funny, but one of the guys I worked with who was like a showrunner, co-showrunner of a show I worked on, was younger than me. and it created a show on Hulu. And he created that show when he was a staff writer, I believe. And so what he did was they assigned him a showrunner to run the show, which will always happen if you're a lower level writer. You will always get assigned a showrunner who's actually running the show. And he decided before they started The Room, he was going to write 3 episodes of the show. So he wrote the first 3 episodes. He submitted it to Hulu, and he was like, look, because he wasn't even a co-showrunner. They just said, hey, this is your show you created, but you work for this show. This is the showrunner. So he wrote 3 episodes, and Hulu was like, well, okay, you're the co-showrunner. Like, so that could be the helpful thing, but they're not going to necessarily, that's not a traditional thing to do.
Okay, Hunter.
Hi, Rochée. Thanks again for this. Really appreciate it. My question's about kind of delineating between character-driven and plot-driven. And I feel like a lot of shows these days, as you mentioned, are kind of like dipping into both, or, you know, kind of the structure is kind of all over the place these days. Have you found that it's still important to kind of like stick to one or the other when you're starting out? And have you found people like kind of clinging to something like being a theme-driven show? Like I feel like a show like maybe a Russian Doll or something, where it's like you get to the end of the season and it's like, this show can't continue the way it is. Like they kind of like threw a weird plot thing in there, but it still really worked. So like, you know, I guess just in today's filmmaking, TV making stuff, like how important are these conventions still, especially for beginners?
So let me tell you a secret. So here's the thing about this business that nobody really tells you. If you watch something that's bold and like really interesting, like Russian Doll, bold, interesting, none of us would have been able to do that show at this stage of our careers, because the reason why that show happened was you have Natasha Lyonne, you have Amy Poehler, and they come to Netflix and they're like, we're doing something. And Netflix is like, here's millions of dollars, right? So they could do whatever they want. Even Atlanta, right? Like Atlanta is like groundbreaking and crazy and amazing. The reason why they could do that is because it's Donald Glover. So they can do whatever they want structurally. They can play, they can take risk in those ways because, yeah, they're huge stars. Now, here's what I would say. I say, like, when you're starting off, try your best to master. You have to master, it's like riding a bike, right? You need to learn how to ride a bike with the 2 wheels before you popping wheelies and riding backwards and doing tricks. So I think it's really good to show that, hey, I know traditional structure and I can do this. Where I think you can shine and show your voice and your vision is in concept and even in execution, and the kind of swings you take, right? I have an assistant and she is a genius, right? She's like 12 years old. She graduated from college like 2 years ago. And she has this pilot that blew my mind because it's a multicam, but the multicam is a really kind of a gimmick, but it's a multicam set on a plantation starring a historical figure and his slave who he's in a relationship with, right? Genius. It's genius. Like, I read that, I sent it to every manager, agent, because I was like, she took such a swing with that, right? But it's conventional. Like, structurally, we have the convention, but it's such a bold swing. You know what I mean? So that's where you can shine, is like, how can I take a bold swing and make something that like no one has ever in their life read before? No one has read that, you know? Russian Doll, again, it's like, yeah, they'd let them do that because they walked into the room and they said, here's $40 million, go do whatever you want. You know what I mean? So like, that's where you can play. Will that show ever get made? No, my assistant show will never get made, but will it get her work? Absolutely, because it's so bold. You see what I'm saying? So like, you have to think about it in those terms.
Kimberly Renee Oden.
Hi. So my question is, the concept of a spec script, is that still a thing? And if so, like where in the process does that come in? Or is the idea that you are creating your own original samples?
Okay, so spec scripts are still happening for reasons that I hate. I hate spec scripts with all my heart, but they still happen. What happened was the reason why spec still exists is because of the fellowships. So are you guys familiar with the, like, I'll say at the end of this class, I'll send you guys a list of like fellowships and stuff, but the fellowships, a lot of them require original pilots, or they used to. You have to have a spec of an existing show, right? Which is a speculative episode of an existing show. So you write your version of whatever show is on, Ozark, whatever. And then you would also have to write a pilot to get one of these fellowships. So Warner Brothers, Disney, NBC has it, CBS has it. All these places have these fellowships where it's like essentially a contest where you're competing with thousands of other writers to get 3 spots, 4 spots, 5 spots, right? What happened was in the 90s and the early 2000s, people used to read specs to hire folks for jobs. They stopped doing that. Now, for the most part, you need an original pilot. Okay. And so I tell people, to be honest, I wouldn't worry about writing a spec that much unless you're really trying to do those fellowships. But even the fellowships now don't do that anymore. Disney is 2 original pilots. I think NBC is 2 original pilots. I think only one of the major fellowships requires a spec now. Okay. So 1 or 2. So I would look into that, but invest in writing your original material.
Thank you.
So I'm going to go to a YouTube comment. It doesn't have the name, it's just a bunch of numbers, but it says, when it comes to pitching a limited series, is it easier if it's based on a true story?
Yes. I'm going to tell you another trick and rule of the industry that nobody talks about. Everything is easier when it's based on intellectual property. Everything. So if, for instance, I had an idea for a show about politics. I come from the world of politics. So I was like, oh, I want to do this half hour in politics. Then I found out, like, this big producer reached out to my manager, was like, hey, we want Roché's take on this show based on a book. And it was about politics. I said, forget my idea. I'm doing this. Because anything with a book, like, people automatically are like, oh my God, it has an audience. So whenever you're thinking about like trying to develop something, if you can find a book to adapt, because you can, like, don't think you need millions of dollars. You could, if your friend has an adult book that people have been talking about, a collection of short stories, whatever, it's a lot easier to get things made when it comes from intellectual property that exists. That's why every movie you see, dudes, it's like, come on, every movie is about something that already happened, or comic books, or some book. It's so much easier. So I recommend, if you can, to find a book to adapt, yes. And then when it comes to like things that actually happened, absolutely. Because then it's anchored by something in the universe. It's not just like, I have an idea. It's like, well, this thing happened, and here is that is of interest to the world, and here is my limited series idea about it. So it always helps if it's a real thing that happened, or if it's like based on intellectual property.
All right, we have 8 minutes, but we're going to try to power through to, as many questions as we can. So Pages Matem asked, so would it be better to have a show Bible or some sort of guide when pitching?
Here's what I'll say. I say that in the earlier stages of your career, absolutely have a Bible. The more unproven you are, the more material you're going to need to prove that you should be in the room, right? So like, when I started out, I had everything, bios, Bibles, everything, because they're going to question you and they're going to, have a lot of concerns. As you develop in your career, I have friends who are writers at a certain level. They could literally walk into a room and be like, I want to sell a story about my cup of coffee. They're like, yes, sold, straight to series, right? Like that's what happens. And like, so, but at the start, you really need to have like as much information as possible, not only because you were trying to convince people to invest in your idea, but also because you need to prove to yourself that it's an idea, right? Because you don't want to get to a situation where now you're having real conversations and they're like, so what happens in season 3? And you're like, well, you know what I mean? Like you really need to know like your show. So the more information you have, the better. Have you guys read, if you can go on line and you can find the Bible for the Wire. The Bible for the Wire is a literal Bible. It is literally Genesis, and it's literally a Bible. It's like 80 pages. It's insane, you know? So like, the more you know, the better. And we saw how good that show was.
All right. So from YouTube, Desiree Eldercan, she asked, can a half-hour dramedy have a teaser cold open? And yeah, let's just go with that.
So yes, we have a whole class about structure. So
oh, okay, sorry, yeah. Okay,
yeah,
so
no,
we'll cover that next time.
Go through, yeah, we'll go through that.
Okay. So we're gonna do another question from Conception. Let's try to let folks in YouTube ask questions after this. Is a lot of questions from YouTube, by the way.
Okay, sorry, my bad. I'll be quick. On the topic of book adaptations, if you're someone who is maybe working on a book or like has that in progress, but also wants to have a TV show, or like maybe wants that book to be adapted into a TV show, does it make sense to even have that as like a pipe dream? It just feels like it's happening all the time, but I don't know if it's actually really happening all the time. Or, you know, should you focus on the script? Like, is that an easier path to get something adapted?
I would actually focus on the book first.
Okay.
Write the book, get it out there. What ends up happening is if you have an agent, a book agent, a literary agent, they can send it out to different agencies before as a manuscript. And sometimes, like at my agency or my former agency, they have a whole department that tracks manuscripts. And then they'll sometimes try to partner, or they'll try to like match writers who are wrapped at the agency with these manuscripts. Like, hey, we know you want to do this in this area, and there's this manuscript that you could. So a lot of books are actually, the rights are actually purchased before the book is even put out into the universe, right? So if you're an author, what you have is the advantage of, this is my stuff, so I can do whatever I want with it. So you write the manuscript, make sure it's good, right? Then it becomes a hit. And then you're like, by the way, I know you want to make this into a movie. Here is the script. And this is the only way we're going to do it. What I will say is that writing a novel and writing a script are very different things. And sometimes actually the best thing to do as a novelist is to have somebody else adapt your work. Like, honestly, because you get the coins without the headache. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, it's better to just be like, you know what, sis, you go ahead and do that. I'm gonna keep getting these coins, right? But sometimes you can also collaborate. You can find a screenwriter to collaborate with, but it is a very different discipline. It's very different.
Okay, thank you.
So, sorry, I'm looking for a question that is not about structure.
Yeah, we're gonna structure we're gonna have a whole class about that.
Yeah. Okay, so if you're trying to obtain pilot scripts that haven't been published online, do you have tips on reaching out to the writers to get a copy?
They're not going to send that to you because when scripts go out, they're watermarked. So if scripts leak or they're not supposed to be out, Rochée Jeffrey will get sued. So no, but if you want to see scripts that are not available online, the WGA library in LA, that's the only way I used to go there when I wasn't even in the WGA. I would go there every Saturday and I would write, and I would also read scripts because they have all the scripts of every episode of television there. There's a whole, and you can check it out in the library. You can't take it out, and you can read them. So that's where you can get those episodes.
What are your thoughts on having one multicam and one single cam pilot in your portfolio?
Smart. It's smart because the business is always ebbing and flowing. So multicams are going to come back with a vengeance because of coronavirus, right? Because it's more secure. You don't have to move multiple locations all over the place. So multicams are going to be in. So if you have a multicam pilot, good for you. Like, you should have that. And then single cams will always have a place.
Okay. Rochée, I'm sure you have to go. We have 1 more minute. So we'll do like a quick outro.
Yeah.
And guys, just, keep in mind anything related to like character, structure, story, things like that. Rochée is going to talk about that in subsequent weeks. So yeah, if you got skipped over.
Yeah, I mean, I could stick around for a little bit longer. I don't know.
For real? Okay.
I could do like 10, 15 more minutes. Whoever wants to stick around. Yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
No obligation if you guys don't want to stay. But before you hang up, let me just give you guys some last minute announcements. There are 3 more parts to the series. Tickets on sale for next Saturday's webinar are now available on our website. Actually, the first 30 people who donate at least $10 will have access to the Zoom chat, similar to what we did today. The remaining group will have access to the YouTube link. So please check our emails, check your Instagram, just, stay abreast of everything. We also have screenwriting workshops twice a week on Thursdays and Sundays, Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, Sunday at 3 Eastern Time. Follow us on social media on IG, Facebook, and Twitter. Just look up Black Film Space, you'll find us. We also have a private Facebook group and a Google group. If you want to join the Google group, email us at info@blackfilmspace.com. And lastly, listen to our podcast. It's on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And we release an episode every Monday. And it covers all aspects of filmmaking, from directors, entertainment law, to lighting, etc. And please write us a review because it'll help with our engagement. All right, that's it, guys. If you want to leave, bye. I'm going to ask more questions. Hold on. Can you talk about finding representation? What's the magic to that? Because
I mean, it's like asking somebody how they lost their virginity, right? Like, everybody's story is so unique, right? There's no one way to do it. For me, this was my story. I got this is what I will say. Your representation is as a writer is not something I even knew was a thing, right? Like, so when I first moved out here, I was like, oh, writers have agents? Yes, we do. And we're typically repped at the same agencies as actors and directors and everything, right? And what I will say, and we also have managers, right? Just like how any artist has a manager who's, whatever. What I will say is that one of the things you will hear is that you will get repped when you're popping, right? What happens is people think that getting repped will make them pop. What ends up happening is you have to create heat for yourself. Once you've created heat, that's when agents and managers come looking for you, right? So it's about creating heat. And one of the ways you can do that is by winning contests that are legitimate. Some of these contests, please don't do it. But some of these contests are actually going to be viable and they're going to help your career because people are paying attention. So contests, hustle, grind. Also, if you want to be a television writer, I'm going to tell you this right now. When there wasn't coronavirus, the only place you should live is LA. Like, being anywhere else and wanting to do television, it doesn't really work. Now, if you want to do films, you could be in New York. You can live anywhere, but TV, the hub is LA. And so the hustle and grind of being in LA and meeting people and asking folks, hey, can you recommend me for something? And this is also after you have a little bit of finesse. Like, you don't want to walk up to somebody who you just met and be like, hey, can you but if you're, working on a show and a writer and you have a rapport, a lot of us get reps based on people passing us along. My story, the way that I got repped was I submitted to We for She, which was this organization that put out a list of the top 10 pilots written by women with female protagonists. And this list goes throughout the industry. My manager and my agent, my first manager and my first agent saw the list and reached out. And that's how it happened. But this was 2 years of me hustling and grinding in LA, passing scripts around, winning contests. Issa Rae and I collaborated on some stuff together. Like, it was a lot of hustle, grind kind of stuff. And that's how I got repped. But everybody's story is different. It's a friend, they were a writer's assistant, they finally got staffed. I know people who don't get representation until they've sold something, a movie, until they've gotten staffed. But the universal thing is hustle and grind. That's it.
Nice. Can you talk about how writers can alleviate concerns about copyright, especially if you're first time?
Well, here's the thing. There are 2 kinds of ways you can register your script. You can do the WGA registry or you can get it copyrighted. You should actually get it copyrighted if you're really concerned about that, because the WGA registry is helpful to a point, but being copyrighted protects you more so. What I will say though is this. It does happen. People steal ideas. It's rare. but it does happen. I will also say that multiple people can have the same idea at the same time. That is just a fundamental rule. I can't tell you the number of times where I was like at a coffee with somebody, I'm like, I really want to do a thing about blah, blah, blah. And they're like, girl, I'm writing that right now. Right? So it is also possible that people have the same ideas. But when it comes down to it, like the best thing you can do for yourself is get it copyrighted. Even if you're a writer who's on the brink of like really popping and you can't get a manager or an agent yet, I recommend getting a lawyer, because there's still entertainment lawyers who will work with you as a client. So that's another thing to consider.
Nice. You're going to talk about synopsis and things like that.
I'm going to talk about all of that stuff in the subsequent class. This
cool.
was like an appetizer.
Okay, dope. Can you talk about the frequency of you seeing half-hour dramas? Because that sort of breaks the mold of what you were talking about earlier.
This is remember what I said. You can break molds when you are already established. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's so much easier for you to be like, oh, I'm going to do a half-hour drama because I'm coming with a huge production company behind me. And we have Julia Roberts as the star of our show, attached as the star of our show. Like, those are the things where people are more inclined to let you kind of break the rules. So I would typically stick to a dramedy or a comedy for a half hour. You can do it. It's possible. But again, it's just going to be more of a barrier for you if you're not established.
Can you mention some competitions you would recommend?
I will send out an email.
Right.
I'll send it out like a document, because I don't want to say the wrong thing. There are about 5 that I recommend.
Okay.
But I'll send that out.
Okay. What about selling your pilot as not only the writer, but also the director?
Again, that is something that will happen if you are a big director or an emerging director in a way that you have a lot of like traction. That's when that stuff happens. What I want you to remember is like selling at this stage is hard. It is at this point, your pilots 90% of the time are going to be used as samples. If you do sell it, you're probably not going to run your own show. And if you are an unknown director, you're definitely not directing the pilot. It's very rare that happens. So if you want to write and direct a pilot, I recommend you do it on your own, right? Like if it's one of those things where you feel passionate about it, you could do a low budget version of it, but it's very hard to get. I know people who are like directing episodic television who are also television writers, and they won't let them direct a pilot of their own show.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Can you talk about using short films and this, not only the actual films, but the scripts as work samples? Do you recommend it?
It can happen. I have a short film that you mentioned in my bio that I've used for different jobs for sure, that my manager and my agent send out for different things. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm just looking through. You mentioned having a main character and there needs to be, and the need for an antagonist. Does it need to be the same main character throughout the season? Do you recommend that?
Yes. Now, if you are doing some experimental thing, maybe, but I'm not going to know that from the pilot. The pilot, I'm just going to know this one main character. I wouldn't know that there's going to be different main characters. And again, I would stick to one main character for that pilot, because it's going to be clear that you can write, and you know what you're doing.
All right, dope. I mean, I feel like a lot of this stuff is structure related, so
yeah,
you should skip it. So come through next time, guys. Thank you so much, Rochée. This was amazing. People said that they learned more today than they did in film school. Isn't that crazy?
I try.
So you killed it.
Yeah, I'm happy to do this. I'm excited. So yeah, 3 more classes, and I promise to get to structure. I promise to get to dialogue and all that stuff, and we'll continue to learn, guys. Pleasure.
Thank you, Rochée. This is amazing. Thank you guys for coming through. Shout out to everybody in the Zoom and on YouTube. You guys had a great chat going on in YouTube, and have a great weekend.
All right, bye.
Bye, y'all.